I'm Dr. Shyam Ranganathan, and this talk is called The Radical Secularism of South Asian Philosophy and the Rupture of Religion and Nationalism. Okay, so I have two connected theses that I want to elucidate in this talk. The first is that classical South Asian philosophy is radically secular, and religion and nationalism constitute ruptures in the tradition, right? Uh, so contrary to the normal approach to South Asian stuff, where everything is thought to be religious, uh, the point I want to make is that it's not originally religious, and that religion and nationalism are really a kind of imposition on this tradition, and they represent a continuity of the Western tradition, not the South Asian tradition of philosophy. Okay, so I want to begin by distinguishing between two concepts of secularism. Okay, so the first uh, that I will elucidate, and I think the more sensible of the two options, is what I call secularism one. Okay, so secularism one is the idea that discourse should be radically open to disagreement. Okay, so there shouldn't really be an official position that one has to buy to enter into conversation, and that what structures the discourse is this receptivity to disagreement, philosophical disagreement, as a kind of basic organizing principle of the discourse. Okay, so what I'm going to be claiming is that South Asian philosophy is secularism one, traditionally. Now, there's another concept of secularism, and I call this secularism two. So, secularism two is the idea that the European intellectual tradition constitutes the content of public reason. Okay, it's basically the stuff of secular discourse, and then anything that isn't rooted in the European tradition, anything that doesn't have that at its very roots isn't kind of traceable to the European intellectual tradition is religion. So what I count as the European intellectual tradition is basically European philosophy going back to the ancient Greeks. Okay, and so if you have a tradition like Christianity, for instance, that draws in part on, say, Plato and Aristotle, it's still religion according to secularism too, because the roots of this tradition, right, the teachings of Jesus, fall outside of European philosophy. And that's why Christianity, according to secularism too, is a religion. Okay, so I call this intellectual tradition going back to Greek philosophy, the West. And the way I write it, I don't mean it kind of geographically the West. I mean it as a kind of political tradition. And I write this with an italicized W that leans on the East. And so my point is, it's an imperial and colonizing tradition. Okay, so one of the things that's really interesting about secularism one is that because it's open for disagreement, it's open to disagreement, all options are on the table. Nothing is left out. Everything can be part of secular discourse, because the point is to figure out, is to make sense of disagreement. Okay, then the point of secularism too is to identify something that counts as secularism, and then define religion as what falls outside of that scope. So on the secular one approach, we wouldn't. It's not that you couldn't participate if you thought that your belief system is religious or something like that, but that there's no way, given the parameters of secularism one, to sort out some positions as religious and others are not. All are just contributions to philosophical disagreement. But in secularism too, there is a way to figure out what's religion and what's not. Religion is just what's non-Western. Okay, and so I think secularism too is basically, we live in a world defined in large measure by secularism too. And the reason I say, and I mean, it's kind of most blatant in places like, say, Quebec or France, where religious symbols are banned, and those are curiously just symbols that are part of traditions that are not European, right? But the reason I think that secularism too really defines what people think of as secularism is that if you look at world religions, the only thing that they have in common is that they're not they're not ultimately reducible to the Western intellectual tradition. They all have some root. So, for instance, in the case of Islam and Christianity, even though they were influenced by European philosophy, they have roots outside of the European tradition. And Judaism is in a way pre-Western, right? But it's still a religion on this account because it's not rooted in the European intellectual tradition. So there is also something else that's really curious about secularism too, that secularism too is a kind of, it's kind of an analog to a racial system where you have a paradigm, say the European, and then everybody else is judged in terms of their deviation from this paradigm, right? So in a way, the European has no color, but everybody else in a racialized world with the European as a paradigm is colored, right? In the same way, in secularism too, the European has no indigenous religion as part of their intellectual tradition. It always has to come from the outside. So even if you think of something like Norse mythology, if you were to think that that's a religion, right, that's also something without roots in the European intellectual tradition going back to ancient Greece. So what's very peculiar about this way of thinking about religion is that it doesn't have anything to do with content, right? So you can find the same position articulated in South Asia and in the European tradition, and that when you find it in South Asia, it gets called religion, and when you find it in the European tradition, it's secular philosophy, right? So when Plato and Descartes talk about God and theism, and when Plato makes a case for the afterlife, that's secular philosophy. You just teach that in a secular philosophy course. But if you find the same kinds of cases being made by people with intellectual roots in the Middle East, all of a sudden that's religion. You wouldn't study that in a secular philosophy course, right? And likewise, right, you could consider the position of the Sankhya as one of the oldest systematic philosophical positions of South Asia, that the universe itself is simply the evolution of matter, and mind and intellect is simply an emergent property of a complex state of this evolution. And we as people, we feel like we have some type of freedom to make choices, but really it's an illusion. It's all just natural causes. Right now, if you had someone say that, but they were saying it on the basis of the European tradition, you would just call them like a hard determinist and some kind of rational metaphysician maybe, right? But because it comes from the Sankhya which is categorized as Hindu, right? It's religion. And the only difference is the color of the people coming up with the view, and the intellectual tradition you find the position is. Similarly, right, the Buddha makes a case that you should choose in a manner that reduces suffering, and put aside your selfishness and simply think about compassion as a guiding consideration, right? So when Jeremy Bentham makes a case for that, we just call it, secular ethical theory. But when the Buddha makes a case for that, all of a sudden it's religion, right? And the only difference is basically racial, right? It doesn't have anything to do with the content. So secularism too, right, not only helps us make sense of why it is we call some things as religion, it also helps us understand why there really is nothing in common with any of the things that we call religion, except for, right, the things that we call religion in our world are things that are not rooted in the European tradition. Okay, so I want to put that aside for a second, and now I want to talk about two competing forms of explanation. Okay, one I call explication, and the other I call interpretation. So first I'm going to briefly talk about interpretation. Interpretation is the view that we should explain something by way of what we take to be true, what we believe, right? Or maybe even what is true. But, anytime we defer to that, it's because we take it to be true. Okay, so there are a couple of features of interpretation that are worth considering, okay? One is that the result of an interpretation will depend entirely on what beliefs the interpreter has, right? So you change the beliefs of the interpreter and then you're going to get a different interpretation. Because interpretation is an explanation in terms of what you believe, right? An interpreter will not be able to account for what they disagree with. So in fact, they won't even be able to acknowledge that it's even possible to disagree with them, because the only kind of explanation, the only thing that they count as understanding is something based on what they believe. Okay, now if you put these two features together, right, that it's subjective and it's not capable of accounting for disagreement, it only accounts for explanation in terms of the interpreter. Interpretation is clearly an imperialistic approach to understanding, right? Because it basically forces on the whole world the view or the outlook of the interpreter. All right, so now I want to contrast that with explication. So explication, the idea behind explication is that when we explicate a perspective, we try to render explicit the reasons that support the perspective's conclusion. And so explication relies on what logicians called validity. Okay, so validity is the property of a good deductive argument. An argument is valid just in case, if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. Right? Now, this is very different from the premises and conclusions being true. Right? You can have examples of arguments where everything is true and it fails to be valid, and examples where everything is false and you have a valid explanation. Okay, so here is an example of the former. Trump is the president of the U.S., said now at the time of this recording, true. Trudeau is the Prime Minister of Canada, said now at the time of this recording, true. Therefore, my name is Sean Ranganathan, also true right now. So everything I said is true, but it's nonsense, right? Because simply because, you know, Trump and Trudeau are president and prime minister, it doesn't have to be the case that my name is Sean Ranganathan. There's no dependence on the conclusion on the premise of the conclusion on the premises. Okay, now consider the following valid argument. Okay, the moon is made out of green cheese. Green cheese is a type of vegetable. Therefore, the moon is a type of vegetable. Okay, everything I said is false, but it's valid because if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. All right. So one of the interesting features of reason that's really worth zeroing in on is that reason is about inferential support for conclusions, right? And inferential support is not the same as the premises or the conclusion of an argument being true. And this goes not only for deductive arguments, but also inductive arguments that attempt to extrapolate a generalization on the basis of a pool of evidence, or inferences to the best explanation, where you're trying to select the best explanation out of a bunch of alternatives, right? What is reasonable isn't necessarily the same as what is true. So explication as a reason-bound form of explanation comes apart from interpretation, and we really have to choose. Either we're going to try and explain everything in terms of what we take to be true, which violates validity, right? It goes against the grain of reason, or we stick very closely to the considerations of reason, such that, you know, if the premises of a perspective are true, the conclusion has to be true. We can't have it both ways. Okay, now, philosophy as a discipline employs validity as a way to get at the crux of an issue. So what we do in philosophy is we try to understand a perspective's reasons for their conclusion, and then we understand the conclusion in terms of its contributions to a controversy, right? So what we do is we employ reason to understand all the alternatives in a debate, and then we understand the essence of the debate in terms of the topic of the disagreement. So this process of rendering explicit reasons for a conclusion and then following it to its logical limit, disagreement, is what I call explication, and it's the method of philosophy. Okay, so I think one of the interesting things about explication and philosophy is that if we adopt it, if we're really serious about employing this method, we would land up with Secularism 1, because every position we would care to investigate would be assessed purely for its contributions to a disagreement, right? The disagreements that we discover as we pursue reason as something that takes us to conclusion. Okay. Now, if we adopt interpretation, I think what it does is it takes us to Secularism 2. where the Western intellectual tradition is treated as though it's the content of reason, and anything that can't be explained by virtue of those beliefs of the Western intellectual tradition becomes religion, right? So why do I think this? Is because I think the origins of, so what my research has led me to conclude is that the origins of interpretation is in what's called the linguistic model of thought. Accordingly, thought is the meaning of what you say. Now, this is a characteristic model of thought in the Western tradition. It connects contemporary philosophers in the analytic and continental tradition back with their ancient Greek predecessors who had one word for reason and thought and words, language, namely logos, right? So this tradition treats language as really the content of thinking. So, but the problem is if you think that language, what you say in your language is the content of thought, then you blur the lines between thought and the culturally encoded beliefs of your language. And so then the line between thinking and believing disappears, and any explanation by virtue of thought on this model will be an explanation in terms of belief, which is interpretation. Now, given that there is a historical connection between interpretation first being based on the linguistic model of thought, and the linguistic model of thought being really the characteristic and enduring model of thought in the Western tradition, we arrive at the motivation for interpretation by way of the Western tradition, which means that the beliefs that are going to be employed when we engage in interpretation are the beliefs that are motivated by the Western intellectual tradition, because that's where we get the motivation for interpretation in the first place. But then if we're going to explain everything by way of beliefs of the Western intellectual tradition, then what lies outside of this tradition, right, is simply going to seem mysterious, faith-bound, not rationally explainable by virtue of our beliefs, right? And in a word, this is what ends up being called religion in our world. Okay, so I think there's like it's not anything necessarily conscious, but because this tradition really presents interpretation as the default model of thought, it generates religion as the category of things it can't come to terms with. Okay, all right. So now I want to kind of switch gears and consider the ancient South Asian tradition. Okay, so you may or may not know this, but a lot of the religious identities that we think of as really important to South Asia are largely a modern post-colonial phenomenon, right? So the best example of this is Hinduism. The first person to probably use the term Hindu to talk about South Asians was probably a Persian Muslim who used it as a way to talk about Indians, because Hindu, Indian, Sindhu is a geographic area. They have a common etymology, so it's most likely just a geographic manner of reference. Then when the British came to power in South Asia, they decided that there had to be, apologies for all the dinging, they came to the conclusion that there had to be some type of word for indigenous South Asian religion, okay, because they decided everybody's got one, and they wanted a word for the indigenous South Asian religion that wasn't Islam, because Islam comes from outside of South Asia historically. And so the British started using Hindu as a way to talk about this. So Hindu originally meant something like South Asian no common founder. It was a kind of miscellaneous box that the British were trying to put everything South Asian in. And then over time, right, there was a kind of opt-out period where people who felt like they had a really distinctive tradition, opted to be identified as members of a distinct religion. So for instance, it's in this kind of time where Buddhism or Jainism or Sikhism end up gaining their own religious identity. But notice that a lot of these religious identities depend upon kind of opting out of being Hindu, right? And often there will be some story about what that meant. What what it was that they were opting out of. But if you look at it historically, it was just a name for the entire tradition, right? So one of the things that I argue in my recent Hinduism, a contemporary philosophical investigation, is that if you really want to understand Hinduism, you have to understand it in terms of its philosophical disagreements, because it's just a name for all the indigenous philosophical positions that disagree with each other. So, right, you could be an atheist and a Hindu. In fact, there are lots of really prominent, in fact, most all Hindu positions are atheists, because they're not theistic. To be theistic, you have to believe in a good God that is the creator of the universe, and or at least the source of moral guidance. And that's a kind of minority position in the South Asian tradition. Uh, and I'll talk a little bit about one position that's often confused with theism, but kind of theism as we understand it from the Western tradition was really not anything that South Asians really bought or insisted on. What's really interesting, I find, with respect to the spread of theories that end up being counted Hindu, is that it includes within it, for instance, Sankhya that I started out with, right? This radically materialistic and hard determinist view that it's just all a bunch of causes, and the idea that you have some choice is an illusion, right? That's a philosophical position. It's also very traditionally Hindu, right? Another very kind of Hindu position is the Purva Mimamsa position. And the Purva Mimamsa position is not a popular position, but it's an attempt to defend our kind of earlier ritualistic practice as an important to a certain kind of, or really the only moral life, according to these individuals. But part of the argument involves not taking talk of the gods seriously, right? So in the Purva Mimamsa tradition, they note that in the early Vedas, where all of these rituals come from that they want to practice, there are a lot of talk of the gods. And the Purva Mimamsa philosophers argued that these were just metaphors. They don't really mean, they're just kind of literary devices. You shouldn't take them literally, right? And then, there are a lot of philosophers whose positions are similar to the Sankhya-karika that deny that there's anything like a real afterlife for us, right? That even individuality, the thought that somehow, we have all that much control is part of the illusion of the causes, right? Which is, an atheistic position to hold. And in these positions, there's no God really to speak of, and certainly not in the Sankhya-karika. Okay, so I'm going to come back to the contemporary scene in a bit. I want to go back now to the very early parts of the South Asian intellectual tradition. And so the earliest stuff that we have is in the Vedas. Okay, and the Vedas are ancient Indo-European corpus written in Vedic, and like other Indo-European literature from the time, they took very seriously the idea of the gods and the requirement to sacrifice to the gods. But the gods were forces of nature. And so the worldview of these people was that we live in a world of natural forces that we have to appease. And the reason we have to appease is that they expect something of us. Like, so the god of fire, for instance, is in us, and it's demanding food, right? And if we don't feed that fire, we will die. So part of the ritual of sacrifice then is about doing something that honors this debt we have to metabolism, right? But one of the kind of creepy things about this picture, and it wasn't lost on them either, was, first of all, there's something kind of evil that we don't want, namely our own sickness and death. And it seems like the only way we can avoid it is by visiting it on a sacrificial victim that we then consume, right? So in this worldview, there's no real way of escaping these problems, right? You just kind of defer them through sacrificial action, which tries to feed the forces of nature. Okay, so that's the kind of backdrop against which more developed in individual formal philosophical traditions come. So the Sankhya position that I mentioned earlier is a kind of formalization of this worldview, right? It's all just nature. Nature operates according to causes. As the causes develop in increasing intricacy, you have the emergence of properties like mind and intellect. And it also gives rise to this kind of belief or experience of free choice and deliberation. But really what's going on is that this is just epiphenomenal. We as individuals, we have to take ourselves seriously for the following reason, according to the Sankhya tradition. Because we don't all share the same experience, we need to countenance a diversity of people. Purushas was the term that they used. That in each Purusha was a kind of point or perspective within the natural landscape. But these points of perspective are causally inert. They don't do anything, right? And it's simply from this point of reference that we have this experience of making choices and doing things. And but nevertheless, some choices can result in good outcomes that are beneficial, and some in bad outcomes. But all of this is just a play of nature. We are, in a way, at most, as individuals, observers of a world that we have no contribution to make. And the only kind of freedom that we could arrive at is one where our intellect reveals to us our inability to do anything, right? That really it's all just a matter of nature and we're just observers. And that results in a kind of freedom that won't allow our natural constitution to continue this illusion as though we have some choice to make. Okay, so that's the Sankhya position, a very orthodox Hindu view. Okay, so the next position I think that's interesting and worth noting is the Jain position, that it kind of works with the same worldview, right? That really we live in this natural world of causes, it's material, and there are all these kinds of requirements of a causal existence that have to be fed. However, their view is that the source of problems comes from this notion that we should really be participating in the natural order, right? Because when we participate in the natural order, it's true we protect our physical existence, but we do it at a moral cost. And the moral cost is that we end up intruding on the space of other beings. So we simply end up hurting others. And so we feel as though we've bettered ourselves because we've maybe put off some type of evil we want to avoid. But really, real moral freedom comes from not participating in the causal order and deciding to do nothing. So whereas the Sankhya position is a version of hard determinism, which doesn't allow for anything like ethical freedom, the Jain position is a kind of compatibilist view. It says that freedom is compatible with causality, but the kind of freedom that the Jains have in mind is one where we simply don't participate. We affirm our distinctiveness from the natural order, okay, as these abstract points of reference. Okay, and if we really, in Jain practice, this shows up in this idea, this goal of salikana that Jain ascetics perform, where they decide to do nothing, and then they do die, but they say it's not suicide because they weren't trying to kill themselves; they were just trying to do nothing. And so, anyways, that's the Jain position. Okay, but I think what's interesting is that it takes the same kind of natural worldview, but provides a different diagnosis of the possibilities of moral freedom. Okay, then we have the Buddhist response, okay, which also, and all of these positions are very ancient, right? They all, I think about the Axial Age, you start to see 500 BC, you start to see these positions really being articulated, right? Then the Buddhist position is that, well, the Sankhya worldview is basically right, right? In fact, the Buddhists take it a step further. They say that all causes are caused. Everything is dependently caused and originating. So there are no first causes. Everything is caused. The problem is that we identify with our individuality in a world that's basically a world of process. And this identification of with our individuality in a world that's essentially process leads us to take a subjective approach to reality. We end up approaching it by virtue of desire. And then what ends up happening is that the objectivity of the world and and the subjectivity of our motivations start to drift. For a while, it seems like the objectivity of the world can satisfy our desires, but it's just a kind of momentary illusion, because what's going on is we're really failing to address what's objective. And instead of grasping onto our individuality and trying to understand ourselves that way, we really ought to not worry about our individuality and instead choose in a manner that's compassionate, because compassion responds to the objective needs of suffering beings, right? So so this is also a version of compatibilism that says that moral freedom is compatible with determinism, and the moral freedom that we have, according to the Buddhists, is simply the moral freedom of being part of a natural world in which our choices can have beneficial consequences for the future. Okay, but in order to really appreciate this, we have to get rid of our own kind of selfishness or individual perspective. Okay, then the fourth position I want to talk about is the yoga / bhakti position. So the yoga / bhakti position is the idea that that yes, it's true, we live in a causally determined natural world, but causality isn't the only kind of explanation we have at our disposal, right? So we need to understand ourselves as individuals in order to understand ourselves as having a unique perspective in a causally related world. But this individuality also shows us that there's a different kind of explanation that we can make use of, namely ethical explanations. So whereas causal explanations or natural explanations come from the outside, right, and impinge upon us as a matter of fact, right? Ethical explanations are a matter of responsibility. And when we're able to explain ourselves ethically, we have a way to understand ourselves as agents who can make a difference, right, in our lives and in the public realm, right? So these are two competing forms of explanation. And according to yoga / bhakti, we really, as individuals, our interest lies in being free from the influence of past choices, right? Not conservative, and also free to make new choices that are to our suiting, right? So we're both unconservative and self-governing. And when we can be unconservative and self-governing, we thrive. So how do you bring this about? Well, you have to bring this about by deciding to practice life as a devotion to this ideal of lordliness, namely unconservatism and self-governance. And as you perfect this practice of devotion to lordliness, you yourself start to exemplify these traits of lordliness, right? In just the way that if you were to structure a practice of learning music around the ideal of music, over time, you yourself would start to express the ideals of music in your performance, right? So the Lord then is a kind of abstraction that defines the practice of what it is to be us. And then by virtue of our devotion to that ideal, we transform and improve our practice so that we come to be lords of our own life. Okay, now one of the essential features of this practice is swadhyaya, which means self-study, but also self-governance. And when we practice self-study or self-governance, we identify the ideals that we have set ourselves. Okay, and so it's an important part of the practice of yoga that people are given the room to identify their own ideals, not to be kind of prescribed ideals by other people, but as something that they themselves identify as a matter of self-determination. And in order to bring this, in order for all of this to work, we have to be committed to a public space where these practices of unconservatism and self-governance and also the freedom to choose our own ideals are the norm. And if we come up against resistance, right, we are supposed to take up the position of direct action or civil disobedience, where we simply assert our right to do both of them, to be unconservative and self-governing. And this practice, which is essentially an implementation of the project of harm reduction or ahimsa, has the kind of the political effect of transforming the nature of public interaction. Okay, very influential view, right? It's people don't realize this, but Mahatma Gandhi cites the Yoga Sutra in his collected works as being the source of his main political ideals. And these political ideas were then influential on people like Martin Luther King and also contemporary non-harm or ahimsa-focused practices of civil disobedience. Okay, so the question I want to ask is, like, what are we supposed to make of these this early scene? So one of the things I want to note is that all of these positions that I've identified turn out to be very influential in the long run in the South Asian tradition. And for instance, the practice that what we often think of as an ordinary Hindu practice of people just deciding what god they want to worship or something like that. That's an application of this yoga idea that, well, you really are supposed to have both the freedom and the responsibility to figure out what ideal you are setting yourself, right? It's not really for other people to decide for you, right? Now, if we were to adopt explication and we look back at this early scene, right, what we would find was an intellectual scene where people were disagreeing freely with each other about very basic philosophical and practical issues. We would also notice kind of interesting anecdotes and records of this political space. I think kind of the most interesting document that we have about the Secularism one environment of early South Asia is the early Buddhist dialogue you find in the Digha Nikaya called the Samnala Pala Sutta. So the fruits of the life of the contemplative, in which we have this description of the times where people were free, if they didn't like conventional authority and practices, to take up the challenge of figuring out their own philosophical account of the world and how to live. And some of them became influential teachers like the Buddha. Some of them not so much, right? And the influential ones that have survived, right, have this kind of important moral philosophical component that help people structure their lives, right? And so you could understand how these traditions would grow. But, if we were to explicate this early period, we would see that it's clearly just this philosophical exercise in disagreement that was informed by a kind of natural or empirical approach to basic facts of the cosmos. Okay. Now, if we interpreted, right, I think what we would do is we would assume the Western intellectual tradition and then identify all of these positions as some kind of religion, right? And we would probably try to interpret yoga and bhakti as some version of theism, right? Because theism is a position that's kind of familiar to the Western tradition. And we wouldn't notice that these people were all that interested in philosophical disagreements, right? We would simply see this as proof of kind of overtly religious environment. Now, if interpretation were a rational approach to explanation, then I think we would have to settle, or we would have to be receptive to the standard kind of Western interpretation of all this. But interpretation is paradigmatically unreasonable. It breaks very basic considerations of reason. And so insofar as people are tempted to interpret this early period, right, they're doing something unreasonable. Rather, if they embrace basic constraints of logic and then tried to understand what was going on, you would see that not only was philosophical freedom something that everybody enjoyed, but in the yoga and bhakti position, it was even defended as something that we should all be committed to, right? We should be committed to a public space where people are both unconservative and self-governing and free to set their own ideals, right? That is a kind of remarkably secularism one position to adopt. So when I look back at the history of South Asia and its intellectual history, right, what I see is secularism one. And what the important historical lessons that only comes to light when we start to engage these early positions philosophically is that over time you have this radical political change that's brought about by colonialism, right? Because once you have colonialism and imperialism on the ground, you have the introduction of interpretation with the Western tradition as the background. So you have the generation all of a sudden of religious ideas or identities, where religious identities are defined in terms of their deviation or marginalization from the Western tradition. And so, to be South Asian and then have to identify with these religious identities is in a way to identify with an identity of marginalization. And there's a grievance that goes along with that, right? You have this sense of being displaced in your own habitat, and that's a product of secularism too, and interpretation, right? It makes people who are it interprets people who are not Western as marginalized populations, and then gives them a kind of sense of marginalization as part of their own ethnic identity, right? And moreover, it sets up this bizarre idea of secularism where the only way you could be open and free is if you just, if you kind of give up your South Asianness and adopt the European intellectual tradition, when it's the source of kind of this anti-rational, anti-philosophical inclination to simply elect itself the default content of reason. Okay, so when we look at contemporary South Asia and we look at the kinds of far-right religion-based identities that end up inspiring and informing how people think about themselves and how they interact with each other, you can't trace this back to the South Asian intellectual tradition. It really is a rupture. So not only is religious identity a rupture, but so is nationalism, right? And so nationalism, you don't find any evidence of this early in the tradition, right? In order to have a nation, you have to have some idea of a kind of, you have to have some type of cultural identity that ends up being the basis of a political organization. And the linguistic model of thought gives you that, right? Because if thought is linguistic, then all of a sudden shared cultural commitments that define your linguistic practice become the basis of thoughts that you could share with other people, and then the basis of political organization, right? You have to, according to this tradition, share an outlook, a cultural outlook encoded in your language in order to share anything in the way of thoughts, right? So you can't communicate with someone if they don't share these kinds of basic cultural commitments according to the linguistic model of thought. So in South Asia, right, we see early on in the process of westernization, right, this push to create a Muslim language, Urdu, and a Hindu language, Hindi, out of a common language, Hindustani, right? The motivation for that kind of religious isolationism really requires that we make use of these newly introduced commitments via Europe. So I think these considerations are important for when we as thinking people want to respond to the rise of the far right and the kinds of problems that we're seeing today in South Asia, right? Because the common inclination of people is to simply condemn this type of religious bigotry as a failure to be secular, right? And I think the problem here is that it simply buys the Secularism 2 analysis, right? Which is that there is such a thing as religious identity, and we know what a religion is, right? How do we know what a religion is, right? Well, we know what a religion is because it's not secular, and what's not, and what is secular? Well, basically nothing indigenously South Asian, right? So the problem here is the entire package that explains religious identity and secularism is anti-reason, anti-intellectual. It's also kind of blatantly xenophobic and imperialistic. And so the kinds of problems that we see playing out today are simply consequences of that political intervention of Western imperialism. And how are we going to turn this back? So I think we need to just go back to Secularism 1 and think about getting along with each other as a product of philosophical disagreement.